But it's just realizing that the executive and the innovator working together, it really is a relationship. It's a working relationship. And it's not merely financially transactional, although there are aspects of that and how they're motivated and demotivated. It's not a command and control. That'll end it. I mean, we've already talked about this several times. That'll end it in a heartbeat. Either the person will stay and shut down or they'll leave. And so it's how do you find the right balance of not over managing or even, not paying sufficient attention to the person? What's that right balance, if you will?
Thanks to our sponsor Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute and the Kyndryl Institute app at kyndryl.com. Welcome to Identifying and Developing Serial Innovators. In his best-selling book, Range, our future guest on the Innovation Show, David Epstein, quotes research from today's book and today's author. Toward the end of their book, Serial Innovators, he writes, the authors depart from stoically sharing the data and observations and offer advice to human resource managers. They are concerned that HR policies at mature companies have such well-defined specialized slots for employees that potential serial innovators will look like round pegs in square holes and thus get screened out. Their breadth of interest does not neatly fit any rubric. They are pie-shaped people who dive in and out of multiple specialities. Look for wide-ranging interests, they advise. Look for multiple hobbies and avocations. When the candidate describes his or her work, does he or she tend to focus on the boundaries and the interfaces with other systems? Our guest's research revealed that serial innovators repeatedly claim that they themselves would be screened out under their company's current hiring practices. A mechanistic approach to hiring while yielding highly reproducible results, in fact, reduces the number of high potentials for innovation candidates. Been there, done that, as have many of our audience. It is a pleasure to welcome back for part 3, author of Serial Innovators, Bruce Vojak. Welcome back.
Aidan, great to be back.
I sprung that one on you, man. You didn't know that Epstein had written about you in Range.
I'm embarrassed, but gratified and humbled by it, I tell you. Great.
It's great. I was delighted to share that with you. And I've surely piqued the interest of our audience to know what a pie-shaped worker is, and I'm going to leave that little nugget right for the very end. And I thought we'd get stuck in, and I'll set you up with some context from the book, because the way you open here is you say, large international corporations spend millions identifying and developing managers to optimize serial innovators' potential, yet relatively little time is spent identifying and developing nascent serial innovators to generate the future growth that companies will need. So this episode will explore a process for assessing the presence of serial innovators within a company. And you outline in this chapter methods for identifying and developing serial innovators at various stages of their careers. That's an important aspect. And the key factors for identification are assessing how innovators engage with 1, problems, 2, projects, 3, businesses, and 4, people. Hopefully set you up there, and we'll come back to that pie-shaped thing later on, because I absolutely love that.
Right. No, Aidan, it's great to be here. Yeah. I'm going to reflect back briefly in the first session that you and I had. We spoke about this MP5 model of motivation and personality and preparation and so forth. Today, we're going to kind of reframe some of that and say, how do we use those concepts to identify people? And there are these 4 areas that you've just mentioned, how they engage with problems, projects, business, and people. And they're kind of a filter that allow you to identify the people. And because they're so rare, it's not an easy task. And, so why don't I start by talking about how we identify them? And then I'll talk about it a bit chronologically too, because I think that's important as well, given how rare these people are. I mentioned how they engage with problems, and this is really when they're given, assigned something. And we talked about this even just the other day. A lot of times they'll reframe the problem, maybe they'll rethink it or redefine the question. But these are people that are inherently very curious. They just dig into things, not from a deep academic side, but just a deep insight perspective. Um, they're systems thinkers. They look not only at the dots, but how the dots form patterns. And they're creative in how they do that, not going outside the bounds of reality, but really trying to deeply understand what's there. And so they really do, they're good problem solvers. They're good problem identifiers, even for that matter. The next, I'll say, qualifier or quality that you look for is how they engage with projects. And I'll distinguish that from problems because problems is how they get into and try to understand the problem at hand. A project is more, how hard do they push? How tenacious are they, if you will? And do they see things through to completion? And you'll begin to see as we've spoken about this, or I'm sure you've seen this, that all these characteristics come together because if you're if you're tenacious, you're going to be crossing that bridge we spoke about the other day. You're going to be taking and assuming responsibility to drive the organization forward. And you're going to see things through. And that characteristic is not all that common. Not only just not crossing the bridge, but just being tenacious. Some people will get to a certain point and give up. And so and you have to have judgment and discernment too. I don't want to say that you're bullheaded, but it's people that really see things through to completion. The third characteristic is how they engage with business, especially because the people we interviewed were, with almost without exception, I think there was one person who didn't have a technical undergraduate degree. And again, not to overly specify that, but it's like a lot of them came from this engineering or science background. But it's really viewing that we're here to make money. And I know that maybe sounds silly to a lot of people, in an audience, but it's an important statement to make, especially in larger companies, because there are a lot of people still to this day that can kind of hide out, getting really enamored by the science and technology and not really looking to do things that are going to generate a new product or a new process that's going to have that kind of financial impact we spoke about. And then finally, it's how they engage with people. They value the other people that are out there and they bring the team together. We spoke again last time, trying to weave some of this together. We talked about how do you build a team? Does the innovator build the team? Do they draw on people that they need at a certain time? Or do they get a team assigned to them? And the innovators are just remarkable. And again, when I'm done with this, I want to give you a little bit of an insight of how we even collected and sorted through this data because it illustrates this that the people that they valued their coworkers. They do value the management and executive management because they're trying to solve their problems. They value the customer. I mean, the very last chapter of the book entitled Love Letters to Our Audience, that was because Tom Osborne said that every time he developed a new product, it was like a love letter to his customers. And again, I don't want to go over the top on this. I know I said this in the last session. These are beautiful stories to hear because you see the very human side of these people coming out when they talk about these things. So, you're looking at the potential serial innovators, and it's not always an explicit checklist like this, but you're asking these questions, how do they engage with problems, projects, business, and people? And then briefly, I want to just take a step back. We hadn't discussed this, but the way we conducted much of this research, not all of it, but much of it was in-depth interviews, extended interviews. We asked the people that we surveyed, just tell us your story. We didn't want to hear their philosophy of innovation. We didn't want to hear their theory of innovation. We stayed way away from that. Just describe what happened. And that really helped. That was something actually that Abby brought from her experience in working in the business literature, social science literature, if you will. And we had, you can imagine just reams of interview data. And then we fortunately had some graduate students who could cut these little quotes out and paste them onto 3x5 cards. And the walls in this room we had were like a war room. They were just covered with all these cards, and we're looking to find the patterns in the data. And it was from doing things like that that we began to see, these four areas, for example, emerge. Same data also told us the MP5 model. But today we're talking about more how do you apply that MP5 model, if you will. So that's kind of maybe a little bit of too much detail, but at least shows kind of how we got there, which I think is important to hear.
Bruce, have you not learned by now, man? There's no too much detail on this show.
I got to tell you, I'm loving it. This is like cathartic.
You found your tribe, man. You found your tribe. So firstly, for our audience, the book is so deep. I mean, you heard there about the research students and the amount of depth of research. Also, what's interesting is the cross functionality of skill sets between you and your co-authors as well that brought a unique view. Each of you had different specialities that you brought to the book. So it's a
We
very deep book.
we couldn't have planned that. So
I
sorry.
heard it was an
Yeah.
interesting, as you say, I think it was in the preface or in the introduction. It was somebody else who spotted the pattern.
Ray and I were talking in the parking lot. We started working together. It was a guy at the National Science Foundation that said, Abby's about a mile away from you guys. Got to talk to her.
I love that. I mean, and that's one of the things a serial innovator does. Maybe he should have been in your research. But I wanted to just say there's an appendix in the book. So if you are a HR manager or you're growing your business and you've got the foresight to go, you know what? We need to develop this skill for the future. Maybe not right now, but we need to develop it for the future. There's an appendix in there, which is a mechanical list of things to look for. But in the book, in this chapter, you identify 5 characteristics that all potential serial innovators have. And I thought we just share these. So 1 was systems thinking. 2 was above average levels of creativity, but not extreme levels, importantly. 3 was innate curiosity that extends across multiple domains. Mea culpa. 4, the ability to develop intuition based on deep expertise. And 5 was the intrinsic motivation to make things, in inverted commas, better.
Yeah. I'm going to reflect back that those characteristics in the problem area alone, how they engage with problems, are just so important. I'm going to mention too, I think here, because I'm not sure if or where we'll get to it later, since we're talking about the chapter of identifying and developing these people, that we feel strongly about that checklist. And, I think you and I discussed that when you have multiple co-authors, some areas, some will feel more strongly than others. And I think I can speak for both Abby and Ray that we all like what's in that section. But I'll also say one of the things that we recommend is having the innovators in your organization themselves participate in identifying these people, especially identifying them either right out of school or even early in their careers. Because it's kind of like we talked about this a while ago, I think in the first session, like the sommelier, they're gonna have somebody looking at currency to say, is this a legitimate bill or is it a fraudulent counterfeit bill? They're going to see these things, and I'll say almost intuitively, they'll see these patterns emerge. So, we did the reductionist, science approach, carve out all the dots, and we feel good about the dots. We feel good about the questions, but in the end, it's this whole, the person that we're talking about that you're looking to recognize. It's this word identify, but it's also recognizing these people, and then the whole question becomes, how do you nurture and develop them, and see if that first guess is correct.
I love that sommelier. One of the nicest compliments I've had ever on the show was a guy, Sangeet Paul Chowdhury. He's a brilliant thinker, wrote a brilliant book recently called Reshuffle. Also, deep understanding of platforms. And he won the Thinkers 50 Award for strategy. And he said that the innovation show is an ideas sommelier. I was like, I love
Love it.
that.
I love it. Well,
So
I'm gonna
you're a
give
fine
you,
wine, man. You're a fine wine.
well, I'm gonna give you a pitch here too, even though that I know this isn't part of any, not that we scripted this, but I just have loved your show, and I love who you bring on and how you engage with them. You go deep in ways that others don't. So it's
It's a pleasure, man. It's an
unsolicited
absolute
pitch on my part for you.
It's a pleasure. So we get back to this chapter because you mentioned there career development, you mentioned early stage development, and you break this, and this is so true. Like even when I think back on my own career, and I was telling you reading the book, you said it's cathartic having this conversation. For me, it was it was like revisiting old wounds gradually opening up and salt dripping into them. But it's a visceral feeling because it brings back those memories and in a good way as well because it shows you that you did follow a pattern that is repeatable. That's the other thing. But you mentioned like in years 0 to 5,
Yeah.
this person gets a break in a way. Like I got a break. I actually 100%. I tell this to the students I lecture. to all the time, that I tell them that I would not have got hired. I just would not fit a normal today's system of how to hire me, and I actually struggled to get a job when I retired from sport. And it was somebody who saw something in me and then gave me all the things you talked about, gave me interesting, actually, the way he framed it was, I want you to go around the company and look for problems that need fixing. And you start looking for stuff, and then you come back with these reports. And I don't think he actually expected very much of me. But you were looking for ways to save money, and you're going, like stuff at the start, Bruce, was like, those guys are using this water supplier and those guys are using that water supplier. Like, we get a discount if we actually put them all together. Like, and in your mind, you're like going, that's just stupid. Why is nobody doing that? And I thought we just share the different stages, and then we'll go into some of the ways early stage potential serial innovators engage with problems, projects, business solutions, and then connecting with people.
Yeah, we broke it out, and I think this is, well, first of all, we spoke across the book about how these people usually emerge in about the first 15 years of being in an organization. And in this chapter in particular, we took that 15-year window and broke it into, really, we talk about two phases. The first phase is, kind of 0 to 5 years in an organization. And I'd say that phase, you really want to cast the net pretty broad, that you're not worried too much about getting it wrong by over specifying, or not by identifying too many people. So what I mean by that is, let's say you look across the organization and you say, there's probably 10 people we ought to think about developing. Even if you think in the end, you don't know which 3 are going to be the ones that hit it out of the park, that you really probably ought to be investing in all 10 of those, because you want to see which ones really truly emerge. It's kind of this Bayesian statistics of updating your insights over time. And one of the things that Ray Price brought from earlier research that he did was that one of the best ways to develop someone is to give them a really hard problem. And so early in their career, giving them a problem or assigning something that isn't going to give them a big win necessarily right away. And I think that's really critical. So, you kind of begin to test their ability with these problems, projects, business, and people by throwing them in the deep end. And we can go into this more, but then the second phase, this 5 to 10 years, that's when you begin to say, okay, of this hypothetical group of 10, these 3 are really starting to show promise that the other 7 aren't. And again, I don't think we use this word. Well, we do use the word, I think, now that I'm saying it. We talk a lot in the business literature and the business world about having someone who's going to mentor you. But in the book, we talk about apprenticeships, and not in a traditional sense like a machinist apprenticing, but apprenticing as an innovator. And a lot of times this unarticulable insight about how to navigate the organization and how to do things isn't transferred by a very explicit conversation. It's transferred by working side by side. And if you've got an active learner, someone who's really going to emerge like this, they're going to just be like a sponge, soaking that up, working side by side with, if you will, the master, you know? So this apprenticeship role, if you can swing it, having people work side by side can be pretty powerful. And it's side by side with an innovator, not to disparage a manager, but the management role is a little bit different than that.
And as the innovator matures, I felt this one kind of viscerally as well, where sometimes you have a win. You talked about one hit wonders. So
Yep.
you've had a win, and there's been a huge personal cost there. I know many people listening will go, oh yeah, there was. There's a huge cost there, and to make it real, you're bringing your work home. You're dreaming about it. You're talking in your sleep about it.
Hmm.
Like, this happened to me, and my wife's like, you were talking about the project again." And you're somewhat obsessed, and there's that. Then there's all the fights you've been through. What we talked about the last day also, about going outside the rails in the outlaw area to get things over the line, getting outside voices to speak in,
Yeah.
connecting all these dots that people can't even see. And you get it over the line, and you're just the company's won. You don't get any credit. You're like a catalyst. You burn up in the process, and they want you to do it again.
Yeah.
Or one of the things that happened to me, I got hired somewhere else for a different role, and then when they found out what I did in the previous role, they asked me to do it, and it was digital transformation. And from the time I had started it to the time I had finished my previous job, 8 years had passed, and in that 8 years, digital transformation became highest priority for the organization. And I knew that the difference between when I did it the first time was kind of nobody really knew what it was. So I was kind of able to be more emergent.
Yeah.
And that was really important. And I knew that the challenge was going to be so big and so difficult. And it was such a toxic organization anyway that I couldn't possibly go through it again. So I was just like going to go, nah, I'm out.
Yeah.
And you talked about that. And I thought that was really important because it could be missed that sometimes the serial innovator just doesn't want to go through it all over again.
Yeah. They develop, again, they develop this insight, this wisdom, this judgment, this discernment to see, I'll say, are they up to it, if you will? Not that they couldn't do it if they really put themselves into it, but, do you really think it's worth the effort? And, one of the things we didn't talk about earlier, and I thought about it actually between our sessions, I wanted to mention, and it ties into this, excuse me, that when they decide on a problem to work on, we talk about how they're assigned a problem and they then maybe redefine it. Many of the people we interviewed talked about how it was important to them to pick a good problem to work on, an important problem, because it takes just as much time. And this is going to where you're talking now. It takes just as much time to work on a good problem as a not so good problem. I don't want to say bad problem, but one that doesn't have the same impact or whatever. And why keep pushing a boulder up a hill if it's going to roll back down on you every day, and you don't have that opportunity for success? So, the people that really do this well, they're not looking for an easy way out, but they're very realistic about these things. They're not inappropriately idealistic about it.
Somebody once told me that, oh, being an innovator is a Herculean task. And I was like, no, it's a Sisyphean
Yes,
task.
it is. Thank you. Yeah, it's exactly right.
But another third category of capabilities that, and this one's important too,
Mm,
if you are kind of going, oh yeah, I know Jenny from our company's like that, or Tom's like that, and you're kind of going, well, you got to understand there's a difference between an innovator and an inventor,
yes, yes.
in that the innovator will be more conscious of the organization's strategy, where the strategic fit is, how that the business needs to make money from this thing, and if it's technology, that the technology has a means to an end, usually to make the company more successful.
Yeah.
And overall, pursuing the greater good for both company and customers is the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's very much a holistic understanding. And again, their innate curiosity is going to lead them typically in the direction of even beginning to realize that it's a holistic view. Um, and I don't want to belabor this. In many cases, um, they're not instructed to do these things. I mean, I think I'd mentioned the other day, if I hadn't, I know it's in the book, maybe one or two people that we interviewed had MBAs. These were not people with business backgrounds. They were engineers that discovered what needed to be done. And, and they jumped into it, and they didn't go too far with the holistic view, but they went far enough to know what was needed, again, to solve that customer problem.
And again, crossing the bridge that we talked about the last day, or snakes and ladders.
Yeah, by the way, I love your chart. Thank you for sharing that.
No worries, brother. So I now I'm gonna have to show the chart. I'll show the chart on the screen for those
I'm
people
sorry.
watching
Yeah,
on YouTube.
yeah.
No, it's all
Good,
good.
good.
So that I'll flash it up on the screen. But the next part then, talking about nurturing potential serial innovators, and you'd say by the end of early stages of their careers, they must have crossed the bridge
Yeah.
and understand that this is a political job as much it is as a creative job, if you want to call it that. But other ways to nurture them. And again, speaking my language, but also the language of people on the show, even people are listening to the show. that proves the curiosity as well. So one of them is work trade show booths,
Yeah.
and actually even just attending trade shows, having budget to go to events. Like, that's something that I've seen. I ran an event last year and I saw so many brilliant innovators struggle, and I funded them to come to the event, because I actually wanted them to have such a lens changing experience as well. And that should never be the case. And the company would not do it.
Yeah.
The other one was to accompany service technicians, especially to customers who have had a catastrophic failure. So there's usually gold in there, treasure in the trash. Work with a mentor for marketing or strategy who exposes them to the strategies and marketing capabilities of the firm so they understand cross silo. And then take classes in NPD, new product development, and commercialization, business strategy, market research, and marketing, and negotiation, another important thing. But I just wanted to add on that. That when I read that, I was like, oh my God, all those things. I remember trying to myself, in a firm, trying to get budget to, like, Bruce, I created digital products, and I wanted to get a course in Prince 2, the project management, and it cost a grand maybe, and the company wouldn't pay for it, right? And I was like going, I am wasting probably a grand's worth
Oh,
of my wage every month by being inefficient. How does this make any sense? And they just wouldn't do it, right? The other one was, and this was again talking to these things in curiosity, and I eventually left because of this, was I wanted to lecture, and I'd been offered this lecturing role, and they wouldn't let me because they were like, "Oh no, that'll dilute your responsibilities and you'll be distracted and all that." And I was like, "Oh, I'm out of here." So I was gone a year later. But those two things link to those things, that you gotta let them develop, because there's a constant need to just, you gotta collect dots before you connect.
yeah. Yeah. As you're describing this, it reminds me of a story that we didn't put explicitly in the book. As I reread it, I thought, I think this may be a story that I had shared with the group, but I'm not sure. Actually, a personal friend and colleague, former colleague of mine, who was an innovator at a mid-sized organization, he ultimately moved into a management position. And I love the story that he shared, that in this, kind of, I'd say, executive level role, he had a group of potential innovators working for him. And they had this idea about, and I'm not going to remember the details, but it was something about some activities on loading docks, shipping loading docks. And they said to my friend Frank, we got this idea. And he's like, well, I don't know. And instead of funding the idea, what he did was he gave him 6 months and a not unreasonable budget to travel to the top, like, 6 shipping docks in the United States and meet with, the key people there. And they traveled around and they came back. And, again, this is just common sense in hindsight, that budget to go out and talk to potential customers. And they came back and they said, well, yeah, our solution is on the list, but it's like not number 1 or 2 or 3. It's maybe number 4 or 5. And then they had some ideas to work on. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what else to say. We talk about being, in the best sense, being empathic for customer needs, doing design thinking. And yet, how often do these things just not take place because of, questions about, the $1,000 for, a class, or taking the time to do something. And it's unfortunately these things play out. And I don't know how you convince some people. I'm convinced that some people are not convincible, if that's the right way to phrase it. And that helps you decide, as you said, when to move on these situations.
And we'll talk about that when we talk about managing
Yeah.
serial innovators. Gary Klein actually talked about this in Seeing What Others Don't, is sometimes your budget demands, so stuff you want to spend money on, there's no file for it. There's no way to actually expense that. And that's one of the challenges I ran into. And it used to frustrate the hell out of me. So you'd go, I want to buy my team a subscription to
Mm.
HBR, so Harvard Business Review. Oh no, no. And I'm going, yeah, but like that department over there bring their team out to the pub every Friday and spend a buttload of money.
Yeah.
And like going like, and you won't let me spend it on actually progressing some way. So those are the frustrations, the way they actually emerge. And it used to drive me nuts, man, the whole time. But let's get back to the difficulty of hiring in the traditional process of hiring. And actually, I was thinking, and I wanted to say this to you again, saying this to the students, how difficult. I definitely would have been filtered out, but now AI is
Yeah.
pre-filtering CVs before they even get to a human. And I mean, how is an innovator going to get through there? Because certainly the AIs, I don't know. I would doubt there's an AI out there that's programmed to look for and has trained itself on your appendix.
Well, and not only appendix, but things like, one of the key features that we saw, and again, this wasn't necessarily a rigid statistical result, but the people that we interviewed, we saw this pattern emerge because we didn't ask this question, but we saw it very early in their life. They had overcome some pretty significant challenges in many cases, not everybody. And it may have been a hardship, it may have been a loss of a parent, it may have been a dramatic move, not a small move, but one that really was impactful to the whole family situation. It could be any one of a number of things. Many of the people that we interviewed grew up on farms. And so this idea of being self-reliant and again, patterns of overcoming challenges are things that how do you develop a questionnaire for those kinds of things? And that's why this relational view of understanding who these people are often plays out because you're beginning to maybe not in the first interview, but if you get to know people, you're going to find out things about them very comfortably and naturally that you wouldn't get in any kind of a formal screening process. And I'll go back to something that you raised earlier today, the role of HR. And I really want to be respectful on this, and I don't want that to be a throwaway statement either. One of the big studies that we did, in addition to understanding the characteristics of the innovators, we had one graduate student interview, and I think he interviewed 60 people, and they were 20 triads of an executive, an HR manager, and an innovator themselves. And that was, you can imagine, kind of tricky to find the candidates to even interview for this. And we interviewed them based on what motivates and demotivates these people. And we may get into this next time too. But it's this whole idea of the role of HR in identifying these people. And they're designed, really, they're designed for economies of scale and economies of scope. And they're not designed to pick the outlier out of the crowd necessarily. And it also means that a lot of times their policies of what they're willing to pay for people and how they want to allow people to be managed, it's tough. And that's another, another front in the activity of navigating the politics. Not that the HR team necessarily has veto power, but they really do influence these things.
And the other thing that happens as well is you see many serial innovators falling victim to golden handcuffs or
Oh,
the fur-lined mousetrap where they find an organization, that organization trusts them, builds them, they have a couple of wins, they get them, they know who they are.
yeah,
Either there's a change of leadership
yeah.
or there's or the organization loses its interest in innovating and that person loses interest. And it's very, very hard to find somewhere else that gets you first to get in there. It's usually word of mouth, it's, reputation and stuff like that. But it's very, very hard to build that collateral. It's very hard to even put words on it. The stuff we talked about, essentially, the connections, the
The
reputation.
reputation, yeah.
Yeah, and it's also like the people knowing who what you represent, not by your title, but what you actually represent, and you're paid well for that. And if the company really knows what you do, they'll pay you well. But then there's a new investor, an activist investor. There's a changing of the guard, or they want to sell the company, and all of a sudden, you're superfluous to that.
Yeah, yeah, and all these things can and do happen. And you're right, mid-career or late career, these are challenges for people, and it can be very frustrating for people. I mean, we know that. So,
So we were going to do two separate parts, but I think we'll keep rolling
yeah,
because and the reason I wanted to, and I call it out to our audience, I wanted to do separate parts because now we're going to shift from hiring or nurturing these people to managing innovators for impact. And I think a lot of the stuff we talked about actually is very relevant to this chapter anyway. So we'll keep going because people will have context from what we've talked about earlier on, including those frustrations. This has become a confessional, Bruce.
And this is
Father
supposed to be
Bruce.
helpful, and I don't want to be a downer here. Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to set you up here again, once again, for this chapter. By now, we expect that you're thinking, we have people like this. It's just that we didn't know that they existed anywhere else. So, having identified these rare but not uncommon employees and having gained insight into who they are and how they work, what are the best practices for managing these unique, exceptional individuals? As one innovator suggested, we advise you let the birds fly. Look at Bruce's cover of his book to see about what that's about. But what does this really mean and how will you implement it? That's what we're going to cover now. It's full of guidance on best how to manage serial innovators. Over to you, Bruce.
Okay, Aidan, I'm going to start with a comment that Ray Price shared when we were doing the research, and it's that the only thing more difficult to find than a impactful serial innovator is someone who knows how to manage them well. And again, that's, I hope you've gotten to know me well enough these last couple of weeks that I don't mean to be disparaging people. I just want to be, it's the engineer in me. I want to just be descriptive. And I think I do at least. And the description is, it's just tough to find this. And especially when you have what I'll say is a professionalized approach to management, executive management. I've seen, especially in large corporations, the training programs that executives go through. And, the professional management activity is, there's books, there's training programs, but at the end of the day, we're talking about a very relational management style that has to emerge to be the most effective. And I'm not trying to make this sound too soft or squishy or, we've all got to sit around a campfire and be, somehow bound in some different way. But it's just realizing that the executive and the innovator working together, it really is a relationship. It's a working relationship. And it's not merely financially transactional, although there are aspects of that and how they're motivated and demotivated. It's not a command and control. That'll end it. I mean, we've already talked about this several times. That'll end it in a heartbeat. Either the person will stay and shut down or they'll leave. And so it's how do you find the right balance of not over managing or even, not paying sufficient attention to the person? What's that right balance, if you will?
Some guest on the show said to me before that innovation is like a dance. Actually, it was
Yes.
Frank Barrett.
Well, actually,
Frank Barrett.
we have that in the book too. It's a metaphor.
Yeah, I know.
It's a day. You're listening to the music and
Exactly.
you're paying attention to each other.
That's what I thought about the leader doing. Sometimes they're leading, sometimes they're letting the innovate. It's like you lead this dance, a tango, and sometimes you have to step back because I want to put this straight up front. This is not going to be Pollyanna-ish. This is not like, oh, you have to manage the ego of the serial innovator. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. The serial innovator is usually very humble and actually doesn't take credit for a lot of their stuff because actually they don't get a lot of credit for their stuff. But I think that's important to call out as well, Bruce.
Yeah, it's not cowering, if that's another way maybe to say it. But it's also not getting these incentives wrong. I mean, if you incentivize the wrong people, if you reward the wrong people, or you don't reward the innovator with appropriate compensation, there's demotivating going on. Because again, we talked, in the first session about how these people are self-motivated to solve customer problems. And a lot of times management and executive management thinks about how we have to put these incentives in place. You just want to be sure you don't disincentivize these people. You don't want to alienate them in some way. And for the most part, I'd say they don't need their egos to be stroked. They really are searching for a shared understanding of reality. And maybe that sounds a bit too philosophical, but it's that engineer or scientist in most of them, they're looking for what really is going on here. And to them, discovering the reality of the situation and what that product is or process that solves it brings great motivation and joy. And so when the executive partners with them in that discovery process, it's again, not to sound corny, I'll stop using those caveats, but it's beautiful to read these things when they really work together.
One of the things I found was you couldn't be the carrot of money or
Yeah.
reward, financial reward wasn't often, yeah, you want it, of course you do, but it wasn't the thing. It wasn't, in fact, for me, what I gave up was reward based on outcome. So it was more, I wanted to actually just build things. I was like, oh, look, pay me a better base. And because I'm going to do this anyway, I don't want because, and they couldn't understand why. And I was like, going, because if you give me some type of bonus based on some type of behavior, I'm inevitably going to bend my decisions based on that.
That's right.
And it's something you call out, and maybe we'll cover the case of Demco and
Yeah.
SAIC that you mentioned in the book, because you see that happening and you see how the reward systems of the organization dictate the behavior of the organization.
Yeah, it's the story that you referenced. And I got to tell you, we were fortunate working at the university. We had kind of a ready-made network there, in addition to our own three personal networks to tap. I had gotten to know Dennis Anders, who was the and I think his title was probably VP General Manager or President of this division. It was the company SAIC, Science Applications, and I'm forgetting what the I and C stand for, corporation, but a lot of independent business units. So I don't know, like a federation of businesses. So not highly overlapping with each other. They each operate very independently. Dennis was actually originally hired by the founder of this unit that was in Champaign-Urbana, Andy Lee, an engineering professor, and DEMACO is Defense Electromagnetics Company. And Andy was an electromagnetics expert, or is an electromagnetics expert, able to design systems that could do identify friend and foe systems in aircraft, for example. And he founded this company, and it did really well. Dennis was brought in to manage it professionally, and then eventually Andy sold to SAIC. So that kind of places us where we're at now. So Dennis is running this business unit, and kind of a small to mid-sized business unit, and very successful. But once they became part of SAIC, their financial model was such that they're setting profits and they're meeting their quarterly and annual financial goals, but they're all beginning to realize that, and maybe not the wells running dry, but you're not getting this renewal, this constant renewal that really innovation brings. And so one of the things that Dennis did was, because Andy, after he sold the business, he retired. Dennis went out and he went back to Andy and said, "Hey, would you come back for a while?" And he brought Andy back into the company, and he carved out a little team to work with Andy. And I'm sure, I don't remember the details, I'm sure Andy had a voice in who was on that team. And they became a little, I'll call it incubator activity for a time period. And in fact, Andy used to tell Dennis, "I don't like J work. I don't like J work." And in electromagnetics, J is the imaginary number. So, you know, Andy didn't want to do what he felt was imaginary work, which was the more formal managing of it. But Dennis could run that interference. And Dennis, just a wonderful person. Again, we've talked about this with other people in our conversations, a very humble person. Uh, and not that he'd be taken advantage of that way, but just very humble, very modest about these things. And he knew that Andy was the guy who could, pump new life back into the company. And so they set this group aside and they worked for a while. They came up with a bunch of ideas. And then, it's something that we had spoken about, I think even offline last time. Maybe you have too many ideas for a while. So you set it aside and maybe you bring it back when you need it and ebb and flow. It's a different model, but it's still having this management style of saying, we're going to set aside resources and do this. And I'm going to tell you, it's not easy. There's a story, and, I'm going to confess, if I told this a week ago, stop me and I won't tell it again. But did I share the story about pheasant hunting in Iowa? Yeah, I didn't think so. I know I had it on my list in my mind when we were talking. There's a story that was, I think it was in the New York Times about a decade ago, and they were reporting on how pheasant hunting in the state of Iowa was down. And what they realized was that the farmers, because they had, only so much, tillable land, they were farming right up to the edge of their property. And I think precision farming was allowing this to happen. And so they were each optimizing their own little, their own farm, little farm. They're not that little, but they were each optimizing their own farm. They were just taking it to the limit, maximizing production. And what happened was all this this ground that had, grassy areas and maybe natural trees that could have been there for all I know, hundreds of years, you know, they were all gone. So there were no nesting places for pheasants. And so the pheasant population plummeted. Pheasant hunting, which was like part of the culture there, was really dying out. And, I'm reading the story and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what a metaphor for business. And, we talk about over managing the budgets, being over restricted. And, I might even riff on this for a moment now. I I think that we've gone too far in that direction. And that's not just, I'll say, someone who's been around too long complaining about today. But I even think that when we have these innovation fairs at a business unit or corporate level where we pick winners and losers, we're losing opportunities to develop managers who are willing to take bets, because now that's been delegated up in the organization, either to a small team or to some executive. You want these executives to learn and develop just the way the innovators are learning and developing that we talked about in this earlier session today. And, how do you develop these people? And too much of a tight control on the budget is going to do that. And in the same way, I think there should be nowhere to hide in an organization, but there should be places where you can get things done that aren't part of the normal. I figured I'd probably be singing to the choir or preaching to the choir here, but
Oh, I love it, man.
but this metaphor of the pheasants in Iowa,
Yeah,
I sadly
beautiful.
love that story.
It reminds me of again McGilchrist when we had
Yeah,
him on, the whole idea, the emissary is taken over.
it's exactly. I'm cheering you on, but I agree with
I
you.
love it. I love it. Maybe we'll co-author it, man.
Yeah,
You have like they're the nuggets I love because I think in metaphor and therefore I write in metaphor. I'm going to double click on J type managerial
yeah, please.
responsibilities
Yeah,
because I think this one, if you're a manager and you're listening to us, I really want you to understand this one because this one is an absolute energy drainer for an innovator. So in the book, you write Dennis, this manager of Andy, the top serial innovator, he freed him up from administrative responsibility. And when Andy is in pursuit of a vision, he specifically asked to avoid J work, a term he derives from the field of computational electromagnetics. In Andy's field, every number has a real part and an imaginary part, and the imaginary part is denoted by the symbol J. Andy wants to focus always on real work, innovating, not on what he sees as imaginary work, such as attending staff meetings, managing others in the group, and worrying about budgets. To get the most from Andy, Dennis releases him from J type managerial responsibilities and allows him to focus on breakthrough product development. If there's anything that makes you not want to work in a company, it's having to go through that. Now, it needs to be done. I totally get that.
yes, yes,
Yeah. But when it's, you're like going, well, if I'm not doing this, I'm going to be doing that J type work, then this is going to be slower. And you keep giving me crap about how quick I can go. So you got to help me here, Chief. And as you say, I've heard about giving air cover, but you actually help them fly below the radar.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm going to quickly add here too, because I think this is a place where it's relevant. I'm not saying that the innovator shouldn't be involved in current business. Because for example, what I've advocated at times is that if you've got a mid-sized company, let's say in particular, that maybe let's pick a number, half the time with somebody who's your innovator probably should be working on current business, because that's going to give them a window to, current customer needs, current problems with your product or process, and it's going to feed that insight pipeline that's going to allow them to innovate. It's really keeping them away from, again, this, if you will, so-called imaginary work, that what is perceived as being bureaucratic. And I'm not saying that that other work isn't necessary. I really, and I don't think I'm waffling by saying that. I think that there are reasons to report and communicate. There are reasons to control and manage. It's just that, as we've said, we both said it, when it goes too far, when it takes over, you lose sight of really the lifeblood of the organization.
A few tips here as well. So I'm going to read out a list here. So
Yeah.
a manager, you would do this by one, understanding that their innovation process will start with a long period in which it looks as nothing's happening.
Yeah.
That's so important because I remember Bruce reporting to the board, and I used to hold back pieces of information that were wins
Yeah.
in order to be able to look like there was progress happening. Because I would plan out the project and go, okay, this is because this thing needs so much work here, it's going to look like nothing else. So I was kind of given like distractions, like the magician's distraction, kind of look over here while this thing, because they were like, on, are you still talking about this project? And you're kind of going, oh God. And
That's
so you need air cover on that. That's one. Two, having patience with and trust in the innovator for his or her process. That's the other thing, because when they start going kind of probing at you, it I don't know if this is me personally, but it drives me nuts because I'm like going, I'm doing what's best for the company here, and you're giving me crap for it?
yeah.
Like, screw you. You know, like no one else is taking on this, and nobody else probably could, and you're giving me crap over it, you know? So, three, running interference. I love that term with more senior levels of management. So that air cover, so important. Four, not burdening the serial innovator with inappropriately bureaucratic tasks, J work.
Yeah.
And five, this is a really, really important one, not requiring daily or weekly written progress
Oh,
reports, because again, because it's even, do you know what I was thinking about, Bruce? It's a brainwave state that you're not in. So if you live in an alpha brainwave state, you're kind of chilled, kind of, you see things differently, observe differently. But if you have to move into like beta or high beta, this where you're like, oh, and you're dreading it for the whole week. You're going, oh, it's Friday and I have to do my reports, and straight away that day's ruined for you, and you're
yeah.
not going to be in the creative mode that you're in. So I just thought I'd share that list. Anything to add to that list?
No, one thing that came to mind earlier, and it's coming back to mind now, and this is more related to the innovator, if you will, selling, but I think it relates to this as well. There was one person who shared very confidentially that he had been explicitly diagnosed with ADD. And when he went to make certain presentations, he had medication that he would take that would allow him to focus. And I was just blown away by that, level of transparency in these conversations. It was just, again, marvelous to hear because you're like, of course, this is taking it to the next level of what do I have to do to sell this, but also what's required by management. And if you think about it, so much of management is looking to have control and communication. I mean, phase gate, you know, I always tell people phase gate is to instruct the neophyte and to remind the expert. And it's also to kind of force executives to make decisions. But a lot of executives use a phase gate to control and to get information. And I don't want to deny them that. But when you're sloshing around in that hourglass model and going back up to the very first step, a lot of people don't want to hear that.
I've coached heads of innovation, and I say sometimes speaking to a head of innovation or a serial innovator is like drinking water from a hose pipe. That's actually
Yeah.
because they're so full of ideas, but they can't filter them. They can't put them in categories that the other side appreciate them, and then they actually kind of go, "This guy's a nut job." Like, you know, what's this guy doing in the and then you start to raise. Then you're not flying below the radar,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they're kind of going, "Do you know if this is a good fit for our company?"
They're locking on you at that point. Yeah.
That's
Right.
it. They've got target fixation. Another thing that happened, and this happened, you mentioned this with the DEMACO and
Yeah.
SAIC, the Andy and Dennis, that team they'd built, that little unit, eventually fizzled out. And you say here, it is imperative that a serial innovator's ability to travel is not hampered, even when the rest of the firm's employee travel budgets are cut or eliminated. Again, this is going back to what we talked about earlier on. It's usually the first thing that's cut.
Because it's easy to manage. That's it's easy to make a company-wide decision and say nobody's gonna violate it. And it goes back to when we talked about the role of HR, I'll say the role of accounting and finance and controlling these things. And you need an executive who's secure enough in their position to make these decisions, or can run, we've said, run cover or have a discretionary budget that allows these things to happen. And yeah, and that's why this pair, the teamwork between the executive or manager, as we rephrase it in the book, the manager and the innovator is so important. And it's this dance because they both get it. The manager knows that they wouldn't be successful if they didn't have this other person floating around in their sphere. And the innovator respects and values the manager. That's the thing. It's not a disdain relationship. It's this trusting um partnership, if you will, that goes on.
I've seen it working in companies, and it's brilliant when you
Yeah.
see it. And you see one guy speaks politique and the other person doesn't, and they translate for them. It's these guys now, they won't be recognizable by this. I used to think of them like, do you ever see the movie Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito?
Well, and of
I
course,
used
yeah,
to
keep
think,
going. Yeah.
I used to think of them as that. A couple of things you mentioned there, ego, and this is a difficult thing. Like, if you're a manager and you have an ego, you're not going to even listen to me
Yeah.
because the guys say managers who have big egos need the limelight, or need to be the focus of attention, cannot manage serial innovators effectively. That's that happened to me big time. A leader I had, she, and it's why she wanted to stop the show. Did not want this thing getting out there.
Yeah.
Didn't want me speaking at events, and I couldn't understand it because I was like going, "This is what's right for the company," and it was because of this, the limelight, the the reputation, and ultimately insecurity.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I'll mention too, as we're going through this, there was a project that Ray and I were engaged on, a consulting project that was, I think the book probably had just come out by then. And it's with a large company that had designed the system where the managers and the innovators competed for the same salary pool. And they couldn't figure out why they were having these problems. And Ray and I are like, how do we tell them, guys? And in hindsight, it just made so much sense. But to them, it was, I don't think it's an exaggeration that to them it was like this major breakthrough, and they were so grateful to us. And not just the innovators, but everybody's like, yeah, okay, it makes sense. But these are these structures that get set in place that okay, I get it, but a little bit of scratching beneath the surface, and you expose these things and put them in competition.
You see it all the time. I experienced it as well, where I found out that the CFO and the CEO were bonused on EBITDA,
Oh, yeah.
and I'm like, I'm the head of innovation. I'm like, I gotta go. Like this, there's no way this is gonna work because everything's gonna be so, like, talk about J work. The amount of J work you're gonna have to do to actually get something across the line is just gonna kill any kind of headroom, any kind of pheasant space.
Yeah.
You're gonna have no place to grow any pheasant eggs to try and create something or nurture something. So
And this is,
absolute killer. You mentioned that actually with the DEMACO example as well, that
yeah.
the corporate structure also meant that people were putting band-aids on stuff rather than actually looking for new solutions.
Yeah, 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 and that's, once you get into survival mode rather than, I'll say renewal mode, and this goes back to this idea, I'm not a big advocate that everybody's got to be like a startup. It's not the model. In fact, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you, the Japanese translation of our book, and I'm not going to get this right, but the title is essentially how innovation occurs in large companies, not like Silicon Valley. And I'm not doing it justice, but it's saying, you don't need to be like these startups. This is how it works in a mature company. And, again, it's a totally different mindset. And I'll quickly, I talk about incentives. When I worked at Motorola, the executive for our division was incentivized based on invention disclosures of all things, which we could never decide why that was the case. Now my direct, VP that I worked for initially, and so we twice a year we'd set aside a day, and everybody had to write up invention disclosures, even if they were, I shouldn't say even if they weren't good, but you know, not everything was good, and everybody got maybe $100 or $200 for a disclosure. The executive met their metric, and it's 2 days out of a year. That's, maybe pushing 1% of your productive work schedule. Do you really want to spend 1% to generate J work, if you will? So
Uh,
sorry.
everybody
This
has
is,
it, man.
like I
Everybody
said,
has
this is
some very
cathartic for me to remember these things.
I thought I'd share a couple of just last thing on this, and then
Yeah.
we'll share for those people interested or intrigued what we were talking about when we talked about the pie-shaped worker. So I'm going to share the comparison and contrast with recommendations of the great Clay Christensen. So again, everything has its place, and I think it's so contextual. So Tushman and O'Reilly, for example, would say, "Oh, you don't have a unit away from the sucking sound of the core," is what Christensen and Scott Anthony and Clark Gilbert would call it. You have it inside the company, because otherwise it's going to be orphaned. It's going to be rejected like a bad organ transplant because it was not invented here. The great example being Xerox. So maybe you'll take us through what we're looking at here.
Yeah, we had a list that appears in these boxes that we kind of stepped through. And as an aside, I'd say if you talked individually to Abby, Ray, and myself, you might get different impressions about which ones are more effective or more common. But one of the things that I'll comment about Christensen's work, and again, maybe this is the Midwesterner in me, I don't want to bash his work. I really don't. I think there's a great value there. But Christensen assumes, as you've pointed out, that operating within the system is kind of destined to failure almost. And what we felt and found was that with the right management and the right innovators, you could effectively operate inside the organization. And so that's the lower half of this box that you're showing here. And so Christensen would say, I'd say he focuses on the lower left. And this is the way we've got this chart drawn, that if you're trying to launch something, a new idea inside the organization, and without explicitly saying this, I'd say without having enlightened, involved management, it's the lower left box, and it's just not going to work. The lower right box, though, is saying, we've got a way to run the gauntlet. You've got the innovators themselves that are self motivated. You've got the executive levels that are willing to advocate with them. It's not exactly the champion role, but it has features of that. And you've got this, if you will, the lower one, the normal R&D employee managed informally. That to me is the sweet spot, because that's the one that I've seen anecdotally occur time and time and time again. I don't want to necessarily argue against an innovator group, but I will say that my feeling is, and that's the upper right here, or spinning out an entirely separate company, is that when you do that, there should be there is an unarticulated message to the rest of the business that you guys can't do this. It's a message to the manufacturing and operations group. You guys are not up to the task to accept this. And, nobody ever comes out and says that, but that's really what's going on. And I think that for the company to really benefit from that existing business unit, working within the system, if you can swing it, is really powerful. And that's why I like the lower right quadrant of these. We saw the top two in the lower right, but I felt always that the lower right is the one that is the if you will, the best approach, because it helps the main part of the company survive and thrive. You're not just casting it off.
I love that, and I think that that's what's happened, and I think maybe the cases that Christensen covered, they were the successes. And I mean, if you look at enough data, it's like collect enough dots and they'll connect in different ways, and things change. And I do think that that's actually a reason that that has changed since his work as well. To give it full respect, I thought we'd finish with that worker.
Yeah, yeah.
So, well, I tee you up. I'll tee you up a little quote, and you can bring us through the
Please.
context. So you say, serial innovators develop just the sort of breadth found in T-shaped people. However, they also develop deep technical knowledge across multiple technical areas. They thus may be described as being dynamic Ts or even pie-shaped workers. And that's work by McCauley et al. 2010, Miles and Jones 2008. You quote that as well. Individuals with a breadth of learning across domains, but with great depth of learning in multiple technical domains.
Yeah, they're what we would refer to as M-shaped, and we could go even beyond that with multiple, but the idea is they're multiply deep and broad. And usually it's significant depth in more than one technical area. And I'll say sufficient depth in understanding multiple aspects of the business. And so if it's a product innovation, they're going to know enough about manufacturing processes and costs. They're going to know enough about marketing, not just individual customer needs. They're going to know enough about finance and how we're really accounting for this in the company. And does this advantage that we think we're bringing really translate into financial advantage? They're going to know enough about, as we mentioned when we talked about navigating the politics, they're going to know enough about their colleagues and about other executives and the 20 other people they've got to sell to. And so that M isn't just I'm a chemical engineer or I'm an electrical engineer. It's I'm an engineer plus, oh, I've learned I'm not only an electromagnetic engineer, I'm one who knows enough about computational work. I'm one who knows enough about the design of aircraft to know how to identify friend or foe, to know what structures I'm looking for and how that translates into this. And I know enough about the business, or I can access that through working with my management to get these things. And that's where we didn't exactly call it pairwise work or teamwork in the book, but in a way, the interaction between the executive and the innovator when the dance is going on, it's the closest thing to pairwise work. We've also seen it, I've seen it anecdotally with a couple of engineers working together that they become almost a new entity in themselves when they innovate. But it's getting those multiply deep and broad activities. And again, this in hindsight, and it should all come together this way. I showed you the charts, the magic eyes dots, where you look at it, you see the image. It's collecting the dots. And it's a directed collecting the dots. It's not just me sitting here watching YouTube videos all day or scanning Facebook all day. It's it's saying, I'm following my nose on this, and I think I have a sense, I have a belief that there's something here. And that belief might be wrong, but you pursue it for a while. And you go through this, again, Bayesian process of updating your insight. And again, if these things didn't all fit together, there'd be a problem. But that's why, I just love talking about this because every time we start talking about one area, another area comes up and it really all does, it fits together. And so the M shape is I think, a handy way to talk about that these are people that you begin to see as having these multiple depths of domain. They also have broad, shallow domain areas, but they're able and willing to go deep. One of the people we interviewed, they were interested in horticulture. I don't know if it was roses or some other plants. They went out and bought a nursery, I think. It wasn't just like planting two plants in the backyard. They would just throw themselves into these things. So
Yeah, was
that's
it Chuck House? He had a nursery.
well, then it would have been Chuck because I remember Ray
Yeah.
sharing the story. So I bet that was Chuck.
Yeah, Chuck did, yeah. And by the way, I want to tell our audience, I'm gonna get Bruce back with Chuck. So
I'm
they haven't actually met,
looking
so I'm
forward
gonna
to it.
get and they can riff over
Yeah.
the experience in the field and the experience research in the field as
Yeah.
well. And another guest that's gonna come, Bruce will be back again to discuss his other book with Walter Herbst and his book No Excuses Innovation. Maybe you'll give us a little preview of what that's gonna be about.
Yeah, no excuses innovation was let's say Walter's and my, love letter, we never called it that, to small and mid-sized companies and mostly mid-sized companies. And that mid-size can be a standalone company, it can be a division or business unit. And some of that is because, mid-sized companies for the most part are the lifeblood of a lot of economies. And I'm going to tell you, I see a lot of those companies just not even thinking about renewing their business. And and it has an impact on regions, it has an impact on families. And so we were looking at how do we make the case to these companies? And so one thing that we did, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it's unique in this book. We have one chapter dedicated to why should you even innovate? Because most books in innovation start with this, unarticulated assumption. Okay, we're innovating, roll up your sleeves, and let's organize this way, or let's hire these people, or let's structure it this way. No, why are we even doing this? And that's this very strategic question that we don't even address in Serial Innovators because we didn't think we needed to. And so we start with that. And then it's, I don't call it a handbook, but, we jokingly have said, or we've heard people say rather, that if you have one book on innovation on your shelf, it ought to be this one because, Walter, who's just a remarkable world's expert on design thinking and these kinds of issues of understanding emotional design. He took the lead on those chapters. I took the lead on processes, even though I see there's a place for them, but not a dominant place. And I took the lead on writing the section on the people who innovate. And then together we combined to write about strategy. And so we can just piece this all together. And we said, again, if you're in a mid-sized company and you don't have a lot of time, especially if you're an innovator in that company and you want to get executives to think about it, give them chapter one. If you can't, in fact, I worked with one company and I gave a draft of the book to the owner. And I don't want to be disparaging, but after 6 months or 8 months, I asked for it back because we had a new update. And I said, "What'd you think?" And he goes, "Oh, I don't read." Oh, well, you do. And it's okay. I mean, I should say at the time it didn't feel okay, but it's how do you get the message out to these companies? Because my view is if you don't renew the business, you're not going to survive and thrive. You're either doing it to survive and it's an insurance policy, or you do it to thrive and it's an option for future growth. And it doesn't take a lot of money. It doesn't take a lot of time. Shouldn't take a lot of time. It should never take a massive investment until you really think you've got something. And then you just hope to find an audience who's able to hear that message and act on it.
That's what we're here for, man. That's what we're here for. You over optimize the field and leave no space for the pheasant growth. That's exactly
Yeah.
what happens, and why this show is about promoting the pheasants,
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Right.
pheasants of the future, and let's pretend it's pheasants on the cover of your book as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Bruce, it's been a pleasure, man. A 3-part series. I'll put it all together, and you'll see lots of stuff coming out over the next few days on LinkedIn. Anywhere people can find you, where's the best place?
Yeah, I'd say, go to LinkedIn. It's easy. If you want to go to a deeper dive, there's a link to my website, Breakthrough Innovation Advisors, but LinkedIn's an easy way. It's Vojak. It's the Czech spelling, and we can discuss that more another time too. So that's
Like Kojak,
yeah,
Kojak with a V.
or Jock. That's it.
An absolute pleasure. Author of Serial Innovators, Bruce Vojak. Thank you for joining us.
Aidan, thank you.
Thanks as always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at kyndryl.com.